On the 13th of September 1890, somewhere deep in the African interior, the Union Jack, that fabled flag of the British Empire, was raised upon a makeshift flagpole by a Royal Naval Lieutenant by the name of Edward C. Tyndale Biscoe. In attendance, arranged in neat ranks, were the remaining 500 men of Lieutenant Biscoe's British South Africa Company Police Squadron. And in attendance also were some 290 pioneers, civilian volunteers, adventurers and fortune seekers. And as the low rumble of a 21-gun salute echoed across the empty veldt of Mashonaland, the British colony of Rhodesia was born. But ladies and gentlemen, that empty veldt of Mashonaland was not by any means empty. It was an occupied land. It was a populated land. But it was also a nervous land. And it was nervous because of what I often think of as the murderous relationship that existed between the Indabele, or the Matabele, and the Mashona at that particular point in their history. Because you will recall in an earlier presentation my making the point that the Indabele were an intensely centralized and military society. They were ruled within and they ruled without with absolute terror. The Mashona, on the other hand, are much more pastoral and creative people, and much more productive people, were nonetheless at that point in their history politically dispersed. Not divided, but politically dispersed, somewhat fractured. And this had the effect of robbing them of the level of social and national cohesion that would have been necessary for them to confront Indabele aggression such as it was at that time. Because the Indabele economy was premised primarily on plunder and campaigning and very little else. And by dint of their proximity, and also because they were a pastoral and an agricultural people, the Mashona people were automatically targeted. And they became the subject of systematic raiding for livestock, for crops, for slaves, and for women. And the nature of these raids, if they were not overtly genocidal, were nonetheless excruciatingly violent. And early histories of the period, which on the whole were written by whites for white consumption, tended to be saturated with exaggerated accounts of the violence of these raids. Primarily, one supposes, as a propaganda tool to justify the original occupation. That being that the white man had entered the territory primarily to protect the Mashona against the predations of the Matabele. Later accounts, which have tended on the whole to be much more balanced, have nonetheless left the impression that the Mashona people at that point in their history lived under a concentrated reign of terror that had the effect of robbing them of their creativity and limiting their lives to nervous ambulation and constant threat. And it was this nervousness that tended to cause the incoming pioneers not to be aware of the extent to which the land was populated. But it also had the effect of causing the Mashona to be presented from the outside at least as being guileful, obsequious, and fundamentally untrustworthy. And the Indabele people in fact referred to the Mashona as the Amatswina, which is one of those superb African idioms that directly translated means the effluent, but perhaps more prosaically the ship. And the white settler community, in very general terms, were more than happy to allow their perceptions and their impressions of the Mashona people to be thus informed. They were more than happy to trade produce and to trade labor with the Mashona. But in very general terms, they were apt to write them off as being inconsequential. The Indabele were regarded as the noble savage, whilst the Mashona were regarded as the nose-picking and belly-rubbing barbarians. And the first challenge to this misconception came in 1861 with the discovery by a certain American explorer and anthropologist by the name of Adam Renders of the Great Zimbabwe Ruins. Now I wonder how many of you here are familiar with the Great Zimbabwe Ruins. Good, well it's in practical terms a 2,000 acre plus walled ruined city located on the central plateau of Mashonaland. And it's generally regarded as being the largest antique structure in Africa south of the Sahara. And for a majority of the white settlers in the community at the time, it tended to represent a little bit of an enigma because it was quite clearly of a social, economic, and technical sophistication that far outstripped the capabilities of the Mashona as they appeared at that time. And certainly the Matabele, who were never mistaken at any time for being a particularly sophisticated people. And A number of fanciful theories were deployed over the years to explain the inexplicable. One of them was the lost tribes of Israel. Another was King Solomon's mines. Yet another was the Queen of Sheba. Another, a race of wandering Phoenicians. Another, the kingdom of Prester John. But over the next 50 years or so, as the mystery of Great Zimbabwe was unraveled, the fact became inescapable, an inconvenient fact, that it had indeed been the ancestors of the Mashona who had been the architects and the builders of this extraordinary monument. Now, the history of the Mashona, and certainly the demographic history of the Mashona, is famously complex, famously arcane, and in fact somewhat controversial. So I'm not going to confuse matters by attempting to shed any light on it here, other than to say that Great Zimbabwe was part of a much wider social and economic network that at certain times in its history stretched entirely across the Central Plateau, which today would be regarded as the central agricultural belt of Zimbabwe, overlapping occasionally into Mozambique, into South Africa, and into what would be Zambia. It was part also of a much larger network of walled cities and structures scattered across the region that were somewhat smaller but no less sophisticated. And the social umbrella under which it all existed was known as the Kingdom of the Mutapa, or the Mone Mutapa. Now, the Mone Mutapa had been contacted and chronicled first by the Portuguese in about the middle of the 1600s, by which time, as I understand it, it was about 150 or 200 years old, and was already beginning to display signs of decline. But it nonetheless remained an extraordinarily rich and sophisticated society, financed by gold, and with trade arteries that stretch back as far as Arabia, India, and China. Now, there are a few anecdotal facts about the kingdom of the Mone Mutapa that might serve better at this point than a lengthy dissertation, so I will touch on a couple of them. And the first one was that, notwithstanding the fact that the kingdom of the Mone Mutapa was an intensely mercantile society, it did not deal in slaves, which I'm sure by now we will appreciate is fairly unique within the African context. So the Portuguese, who dealt in both slaves and gold, were required to look elsewhere for gold, for slaves, whilst they could find all the gold that they wanted in the kingdom of the Mone Mutapa. And the second fact is that the kingdom was ruled by a semi-deified dynasty, which tended to imply that the Mutapa did not derive his authority from either economic or from military power, but from the grace of God, which in turn implied a certain amount of stability on the throne. And this created the possibility for the emergence of a loose confederation of independent chieftainships and centers of power which were scattered across the Central Plateau, itself nurturing the emergence of social and economic hotspots, likewise scattered across the Central Plateau, meaning that for a brief period it was possible for wealth to accrue to the individual independent of the centers of power, which again in the Bantu African context is quite unique. This meant that for a short while society was underwritten by individual creativity and individual effort and achievement, meaning again that society in general terms was relatively rich and relatively sophisticated, which would have been the essential conditions necessary for the emergence of a monument of quite the standard of the Great Zimbabwe. But the weakness in the system was that it lacked cohesion. And this meant that as the kingdom of the Mone Mutapa declined into the 18th and 19th centuries, what emerged was the Mashona people, disunited, fractured, with nothing but really a handful of shared cultural peculiarities and a common language to identify it as a race. And this also, of course, would have represented the perfect conditions for conquest once the much more powerful, centralized and disciplined Ndebele people arrived on the scene. Because as the kingdom of the Mone Mutapa was in decline, a much more powerful and frightening force had been conceived and was gestating just over the southern horizon. In the beginning of the 19th century, the Zulu nation exploded into existence under the leadership of an Alexandrian military general by the name of Shaka Senzanikona. Shaka Zulu, I'm sure all of you have heard that name. Shaka, in my opinion at least, was one of the most gifted generals in the entire history of warfare. He introduced tactical and equipment advances into African warfare that was so incredibly in advance of its times. And he himself was so politically potent and so charismatic that the emergence on the coastal littoral of Natal of a full military society of enormous power and reach was almost inevitable. and this is in fact precisely what happened. But the Ndebele people began their existence as just a small unit within that much larger Zulu military machine. They were known then as the Khumalo clan, or the Khumalo regiment, acting really as a single military regiment in the Zulu military configuration. And they were led by a no less gifted military commander by the name of Mzilikazi. Anybody heard of that name? Mzilikazi, for reasons that have tended to remain somewhat obscure to history, rebelled against the central authority of Shaka. And as a consequence, he was required to flee the realm, which he did, taking with him not only his Khumalo people, but also all of these advanced Zulu military theories, practices, and ideologies. And so as a consequence, between 1823, when the Exodus started, and 1839, the Khumalo people ambulated across the high veld of southern Africa in a rolling military operation that came to be known as the Path of Blood. And the tactics of this operation were extremely simple. Mzilikazi identified vulnerable village structures, they were attacked, and they were virtually annihilated. The old and the young were put to the spear, and those, crucially, of productive age, were seconded into slavery with the opportunity, should they survive, of being inducted into military service. And it was during this time that the Khumalo people acquired the name Amatabele. This after the alarm call, Amatabele, that used to ring across the hillsides and valleys as the Khumalo horde bore down on their target. Amatabele is a species, or was the name for a species of black soldier ants that marched in mass formations, destroying everything within their path. And in this way, under conditions of exile and exodus, the Ndebele people emerged, they assimilated, and they grew into a Spartan-like military society of almost obsessive discipline and rigidity. And the Ndebele exodus eventually carried the children of Mzilikazi northwards across the Limpopo River, ultimately to settle in the territory that we would today recognize as the Matabeleland province of Zimbabwe. And there, the Ndebele would have immediately identified the Mashona as being a viable subject for their military interest. At which point, the children of the Monomatapa were awoken from a 200-year slumber, both abruptly and violently. And so between 1839, with the arrival of the Ndebele, and 1890, with the arrival of the white man, the Mashona people suffered acutely at the hands of the Ndebele. So one supposes then that the best that can be said with the arrival of the British South Africa Company pioneer column on the high veld of Mashonaland in 1890 was the fact that the implementation of law had the effect of immediately curtailing these extraordinarily destructive Matabele raids. But for the Mashona people, the cost of this was astronomical. And really, in practical terms, it was nothing less than the complete and utter dispossession of all of their land. Now you'll notice that this is the first time that I've used the term land in this context. This was the beginning of this iconic land issue that plagued Rhodesia throughout its existence and continues to plague Zimbabwe today. And how this was achieved in purely legalistic terms in relation to the Act of the Berlin Conference of 1885 is quite interesting. Because you will recall that the British South Africa Company were given mineral rights to Mashonaland. No mention was made at any time of the right to occupy, utilize, or alienate land. And so as a consequence, Lobengula, somewhat in an act of desperation, decided he would try and play one off against the other. And he signed a second treaty, conceding all of the land of Mashonaland to a rival conglomerate to Cecil John Rhodes, headed by a German financier and philanthropist by the name of Edward Lippert. And when Rhodes heard about this, he did not, as you might imagine, immediately attempt to discredit the legality or the legitimacy of the Lippert concession. But very much in the style of his operation, he simply negotiated for it, and he purchased it for the sum of £45,000, rendering himself immediately the lord not only of the minerals of Mashonaland, but now also the land. So in effect, Cecil John Rhodes and the British South Africa Company owned Mashonaland. And what's more, in his hand, he had a document bearing the mark of the incumbent indigenous leadership. And once again, Lobengula had been extremely adroitly outmaneuvered. But for the Matabele, matters would get a great deal worse than this. Because the gold and diamonds that Cecil John Rhodes had so confidently predicted would be in abundance in Mashonaland, and which in fact he had used to underwrite the original flotation of the British South Africa Company, proved not to be there. And in respect to the fact that a war with the Ndebele at this point had become inevitable, one way, somehow, the strategy of seizing Matabeleland as an additional asset to the British South Africa Company portfolio began to appear to be, in the short term at least, a reasonable strategy to uplift investor interest and confidence in British South Africa Company stock, because by then there was a bear market in British South Africa Company stock on the London Exchange. And we all know by now that the Ndebele lost that war, and they lost it comprehensively. And by the simple rules of conquest, which a people like the Matabele, a conquering people, more than any other could be expected to understand, Matabeleland now also became the sole property of the British South Africa Company. And what happened then, no matter how it is spun, and I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, in recent years it has been spun every which way you can imagine, it was a low watermark, not only of British South Africa Company involvement, but of British imperial history on the continent in general. Because as the fog of war hung over the battlefield, hundreds of thousands of Ndebele cattle and millions of acres of Ndebele land were sequestered as the booty of war. And before the imperial government had an opportunity to ascertain what was taking place and to react, this was turned around immediately and redistributed to company shareholders and to other important people who in one way or another had aided Cecil John Rhodes on his journey up until that point. And for a majority of Ndebele, what this practically meant that overnight they had become squatters, they had become tenants on their own land. Oftentimes, and actually almost exclusively, owing their allegiance now to absentee landlords who had not, and for the most part would not, ever set foot in the territory. For the remainder, it was a matter then of being relocated into native reserves. But the matter did not end there. 3 years later, in 1896, the Matabele rebelled, taking the white settler community of Matabeleland entirely by surprise. Large numbers of them were killed. Those that managed to survive took refuge in Bulawayo, which very quickly became a siege town. And the whites in Mashonaland were not in a position to help that much, because no sooner had the Ndebele launched their raid than the Mashona launched a similar raid on the back of the Ndebele rebellion. The only advantage to the British South Africa Company was that these raids, these rebellions were not united. They were fought as separate campaigns and on separate fronts, which gave the British South Africa Company the opportunity, once they had had a chance to regroup and reorganize, to crush both rebellions relatively easily. But it was the Mashona rebellion that was crushed more comprehensively and more brutally, for the simple fact that in the absence of any centralized authority or any centralized leadership or committee of leadership with which to negotiate, it became necessary to suppress individual chieftainships and pockets of resistance in such a way as to ensure that they would never be in a position to rise up against British occupation ever again. But for the Ndebele, things were somewhat different. They were a united people. So once the inevitability of this defeat became apparent to them, they were in a position as a united people to seek refuge in the tangled hill country of the Matopos region. Now, are there any of you here who are familiar with that area? Good. Well, the Matopos is absolutely an area of tangled hill country. And this gave the Ndebele the opportunity to say that they were going to take refuge and fight to the very last man. Perhaps more practically, at least to hold out for one more season. And as he mentally calculated the likely cost of this, Cecil John Rhodes was absolutely appalled. Because he was in a uniquely difficult position at that point, because should the cost of suppressing the twin rebellions exceed the capacity of the British South Africa Company purse, then in all likelihood the imperial government would become involved, at which point there would be imperial superintendentship, imperial oversight on British South Africa Company operations in the country. And this was something that Cecil John Rhodes was extremely keen to avoid. And so he began to make overtures of peace to the Ndebele. Overtures which were very cautiously accepted. And thereafter Rhodes himself entered the Matopos region, and at no small risk to himself, sojourned there for a couple of weeks, meeting with and hearing the grievances of a succession of Matabele chiefs, elders, and military generals. And interestingly, this is one of the most iconic images of early Rhodesian history from both sides of the race divide. Because at this point, Rhodes, in respect of his own mortality, was tending to think less in terms of his grand imperial vision and much more in terms of securing his legacy and securing his monuments. And perhaps to a certain extent even redeeming himself in the eyes of the Ndebele, who had become, in some ways, in his eyes, his noble savage. And so, in offering a hand to this noble warrior waste, now prostrate in the dust, he, in a way, appealed very much to the Ndebele sense of saga, their sense of heroism, their sense of tragedy, their sense of poignance. They were without a chief. They were without a king. And Rhodes, in an obscure way, offered himself to be the king of the Matabele. And a bizarre fraternal bond was formed at that point. And it was a true bond because the Ndebele commemorated Rhodes' death in 1902 at the age of 49. They celebrated his internment in their sacred country of the Matopos. But more acutely, a spontaneous Ndebele guard of honor stood vigil over Rhodes' grave for 30 years. But in terms of the negotiations that took place, what was agreed to in effect was that certain guarantees would be in place in relation to the continued use and occupation of the land by the Ndebele. They were given that moral lifeline, which of course the Mashona were not. As that was taking place, the Mashona were being dynamited out of caves, were being shot and virtually annihilated. But Rhodes had a particular fixation with the Matabele. But it was somewhat unfortunate that he entered into these negotiations very much upon his own recognizance. And so nothing that he agreed to in the Matopos, in what came to be known as the Great Ndabas, was necessarily binding on the company. But such was the stature of Rhodes' personality that everything that he agreed to endured until his death in 1902. But unfortunately, nothing endured beyond that. But one might suppose that by the turn of the century it hardly mattered, because by then Mashonaland and Matabeleland had been incorporated as provinces into a much larger British colony, now known as Southern Rhodesia. And this was a British colony where, for better or for worse, a white man owned the preponderance of the land. And so for the remainder of Rhodesian history, or at least until the end of the 1970s, this issue of land was never again brought up in any public forum. It had become a fait accompli. It was de facto. And this was apparent to both races. But in my opinion, the white settler community were guilty of failing to appreciate the extent to which the embers of this burning issue of land remained insulated deep in the belly of a surly nation, ready to be fanned back into flames, one supposes, only with the acquired confidence that would come with a familiarity and an understanding of the modern world and of modern politics. And this, of course, would come only with education. And as we've heard, the 1920s and the 1930s witnessed the emergence of what might be regarded as the first generation of nominally educated blacks into the workforce and into the mainstream of society. But unfortunately for these men and women, the monolith of white rule in Southern Africa was frankly unassailable. And there were no serious challenges made to it at that point. The emergence of black politics in the 1930s and the 1920s was in fact confined just to social clubs and to very mild pressure groups, early trades unions and such like that, attempted to work within the system in order to wriggle out some sort of political space in an increasingly constricted system, and to try and ameliorate some of the worst excesses of white government, again within an increasingly racist and constricting system. It was not until the 1940s and the 1950s, with the first generation of highly educated blacks, the first doctorate degrees, the first master's degrees, that the first serious challenge to white rule in Southern Africa was made across the board. And interestingly, at this point, from this generation would emerge two names that would grow into the titans of the black liberation struggle in Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwe liberation struggle. And these names were Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo. Now, we all have heard of Robert Mugabe. We've discussed a bit of him. We're going to talk about him a fair bit later. But has any of you ever heard of Joshua Nkomo? Yeah. All right. Well, I'm glad about that. Nkomo was the older of the two men. He was the leader of what was known as ZAPU, or the Zimbabwe African People's Union, which began its existence as a broad-based political party, but was fairly soon narrowed down to represent really just the interests of the Ndebele minority. Mugabe, on the other hand, was the Supremo of ZANU, the Zimbabwe African National Union, and in fact he remains the Supremo of ZANU to this day. He was born in 1924 into the Chishona-speaking Sezulu clan, and he was educated to a primary level at least by the Jesuit fathers of the Kutama mission in the Juma province of Rhodesia. Now there have been quite a number of biographies of Mugabe published already so far, and I've read, I would say, most of them. But the impression that I'm left with of Mugabe as a youngster was that he was a prickly and sensitive child. He was friendless, he was intense, and he was obsessively devoted to study. And there are a couple of anecdotes that have emerged from his school experience that I think perhaps might be worth repeating. And the first concerns the Prime Minister of Southern Rhodesia at that point, who was a man by the name of Sir Godfrey Huggins. And by all accounts, Huggins was a charming and amiable man. But when he visited Kutama Mission on an official visit sometime in the late 1930s, he was perfectly able to shake hands with all of the Jesuit fathers, but he was unable to shake hands with a black man. And then a little while later, the territorial governor, the imperial governor, a man by the name of Sir Cecil Rodham Hunter, visited the Kutama Mission as well. And when he was asked by the Jesuit fathers what the imperial government could do to facilitate the development of a clinic on the mission property, he was heard to reply, "But aren't there too many natives in the territory already?" Now obviously this would have caused some small amount of embarrassment amongst the Jesuit fathers, but not a huge amount. But listening to this would have been a teenage Robert Mugabe. And the implications of those two actions, according to his biographies, were buried in his mind. And I would venture to say that they remain buried in his mind. But of the two men, it was Joshua Nkomo who emerged on the nationalist political scene in Rhodesia first. And he in fact was a fairly modestly educated man by the standards of the times, or by the club of young black nationalist leaders at the time. He had been forced, along with a lot of other people of his generation, to beg and borrow a secondary education and a somewhat third-rate college education whilst he was working in South Africa. And this yielded to him nothing more than a fairly humble BA in social work. And this he then used in 1947 when he returned to Rhodesia to secure employment with the railways of Rhodesia. But more importantly, he gave him access to the Rhodesian Railway Workers Union, which was the first all-black trades union that took root on a national scale in the country. And he became an activist and an organizer within the union. And this then gave him access to the leadership committee of the Southern Rhodesian African National Congress, a political party, or perhaps a proto-political party, fashioned very much along the lines of the South African ANC, which had been founded in 1912, and which in fact itself was modeled very much along the lines of the Indian Congress Party. And in 1952, Nkomo was elected to the leadership of the party, elected to the presidency. He may have been, however, the first authentic nationalist leader within Rhodesia, but he was not by any means the most radical. This distinction belongs to Robert Mugabe. Mugabe emerged from Fort Hare University, that nursery of the African Revolution, in 1951 with a much more respectable BSc in economics, and this would be the first of 9 degrees that he would earn. The remaining 8, incidentally, all of which he earned in prison. From South Africa, he immigrated to northern Rhodesia, which at the time had a significantly less restrictive race policy than either southern Rhodesia or South Africa, and there he worked as a school teacher. And then from there he responded to an invitation that was issued by Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah for all African intellectuals and all African graduates and everybody of interest and substance to join him in a pan-African outreach to push forward the process of the African Revolution throughout the rest of Africa. Bear in mind that Ghana was the first British territory to achieve independence. And it almost goes without saying that whilst he was in Ghana, he would have been deeply inspired by what was taking place in that country. This obviously was before the rot set in. It was during the period of profound inspiration. But also, of course, he would have remained very much informed on the political process that was taking place back in southern Rhodesia, where Joshua Nkomo remained very much at the helm of a now exploding black African movement, notwithstanding the fact that behind him was building a solid core of young radical black intellectuals who were tending to drive the direction of the revolution in ways that Joshua Nkomo would have been somewhat uncomfortable with. Because we're talking now about, the 1959, 1960, 1961, at which point European colonies were falling like dominoes across the European colonial spectrum in Africa. And there was an expectation in southern Rhodesia that just a small amount of applied violence and a certain amount of political indiscipline would be enough to chase the white man out of the country, as had been the case in the rest of British Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria, Ghana, etc. The British had left with a minimum of resistance. And this was the expectation in southern Rhodesia. Little did they know, of course, that there would be 17 years of war to follow. But Mugabe returned in 1961, and he would immediately have become caught up in this ferment of political excitement and violence. Because it is worth pointing out that up until that point, he had diligently avoided any overt political commitment. And the reason for this, according to at least a few of his biographers, is because he was at that point a committed Catholic, as he remains today. But he found the teachings of communism to be incompatible with his faith. He was perfectly in tune with the aims and objectives of the revolution, obviously the correcting of historical imbalances, etc. But the vehicle in common use at the time was not to his taste. But he was nonetheless a young black intellectual, and so he came under enormous pressure. And I suppose it's also fair to say that within the African context, sometimes the only thing more dangerous than being on the wrong side is being on no side at all. And so as a consequence, Mugabe very quickly became caught up in the rough and tumble of nationalist politics in the townships of Rhodesia at the time. And I would dare say that he immediately discovered his vocation. And his first steps down that revolutionary road were as a party organizer and activist responsible for establishing the youth wings, the youth brigades. Now I'm sure you can appreciate that youth within the African political context is quite a sinister concept. Youth are to be found ever at the cutting edge of political enforcement, and there again in Africa political enforcement is pretty hardcore. And I find this interesting because this sheds a fairly early light on Mugabe's Machiavellian sense of power and power projection, because he was after all a school teacher, and he of all people could be expected to understand and know how to manipulate the susceptibilities of the youth. And this he certainly did. He launched a program that he called Positive Action, which was really just some of the most horrendous urban violence that was witnessed at the time, intimidating anybody disinclined to become part of the revolution to become involved. But he also would have become recognized fairly early on as being one of the key ideas men within the party, one of the key strategists. And at the same time, one can imagine that he began to attract the suspicion of some of the old guard who at that point would have been represented by someone like Joshua Nkomo, who would have been deeply suspicious of this bright young spark by the name of Robert Mugabe. But at that point he was a junior member of the party, and there wasn't a whole lot that he could do to project his voice into the leadership committee. But he was an extremely shrewd man even then. And I believe he realized that a man like Joshua Nkomo, given enough rope, would be likely to hang himself. And this, incidentally, was exactly what happened. And the story of how it happened is quite interesting, and if you'd allow me, I'd like to tell it. You will recall in an earlier presentation, I made the point that the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland had gone ahead against concentrated black resistance. And this resistance had been focused, or had tended to be focused, in Nyasaland, the future Malawi, which had always been one of the more loosely governed and more liberally governed of the British territories. So as a consequence, it was much more politically alert and much more politically vibrant than any. And the demand in Nyasaland was for secession from the Federation and for independence now. And notwithstanding deep anxiety being expressed by the white population of southern Rhodesia, the British imperial government on the whole was very sympathetic to this demand and appeared to be very willing to give independence. And as something of a preemptive measure, the territorial government of southern Rhodesia instituted a blanket ban on all black political activity and all black political parties, which for the times was quite benign. We're talking about 1959 now. But it had the effect of freezing Joshua Nkomo's blood. Because within that, he could recognize the beginnings of a political crackdown. And what would a political crackdown within the African context likely mean? A political show trial and a long and dreary prison sentence of exactly the sort that Nelson Mandela and his ANC colleagues were settling into at precisely that moment in history. Because Nkomo was no Nelson Mandela. He was grossly overweight, he was comfort-loving, he was a soft and somewhat venal man. He had absolutely no appetite for the bare-knuckle trench fighting of the revolution. And so he thought it would be a much better idea to locate the executive committee into exile and there establish a shadow leadership committee after which the revolution can be coordinated in much more comfort and a great deal more security. But he realized that the young radicals like Robert Mugabe would never accept this. And so as a consequence, he came up with a fairly uncertain plan. And in essence, what he did is he manufactured the lie that the Tanzanian president, Julius Nyerere, had ordered the executive committee of the Zimbabwe Revolution to relocate to Tanzania in order to establish a leadership in exile. Now, it's probably worth mentioning that Julius Nyerere was also the doyen of the Frontline Movement. Now, the Frontline Movement was an organization of recently liberated African states confronting the last bastions of imperialism in Africa. Those bastions were Mozambique, Rhodesia, Angola, and South Africa. And this would imply that the frontline states were then Botswana, Zambia, and Tanzania. And if a leader of the stature of Julius Nyerere was to issue an order like that, it would be very unwise to ignore it, particularly when one considers that the frontline states were the platform for the continuation of the African Revolution. Now, obviously what Nkomo was hoping to achieve here was that once this move had become de facto, he could then present it to his leadership committee and to the Tanzanian government as a fait accompli. But this did not take place. Nyerere was deeply irritated to be put upon in this way. And his leadership committee, once they realized that they had been duped, were absolutely outraged. And Nkomo was deeply censored. And the result split in the movement, creating two brand new political parties. The first of which, of course, was ZAPU, the Zimbabwe African People's Union. And this represented the character of the old leadership, and of course Nkomo was returned to the presidency of that party. But the young radicals, including Mugabe, formed up under the banner of ZANU, the Zimbabwe African National Union. And one supposes it was unfortunate that by dint of protocol, the leadership of ZANU was returned to a pedigreed nationalist of the old guard by the name of Ndabaningi Sithole. We've mentioned him before. Ndabaningi Sithole was a moderate and he was a member of the old guard. But it is fortunate, perhaps, that Mugabe was now no longer a junior member of the party. He was now a member of the senior executive. So increasingly it tended to be his voice and his actions that was driving forward the evolution of the party manifesto. But be that as it may, all of the nationalist leaders now became under enormous pressure to leave Tanzania and head back to southern Rhodesia in order to confront the revolution head on. Nkomo was the first to leave, followed by Mugabe and followed by Ndabaningi Sithole. And immediately that the news became general of a split in the party, there was an explosion of black-on-black violence within the countryside and the townships of Rhodesia as both political parties grappled for dominance. Mugabe's return to southern Rhodesia in December of 1963 was followed immediately by his arrest on charges of sedition. And the first 3 months of 1964, the news was dominated by the events of his trial, which of course you can imagine that he used to showcase to absolute maximum effect. His voice was uncompromising, his demands were fearless. We want the power, we want the land, and we want them now. And all of this was wrapped up in a radical Marxist package that had been finely crafted to cut straight to the heart of white fears. If he had been a political non-entity up until this point, he manifestly was no longer. He was handed down a 21-month prison sentence that in practical terms became an open-ended prison sentence that would last in the end 11 years. He was followed into prison soon afterwards by Ndabaningi Sithole and Joshua Nkomo, and all of the substantive leadership of both political parties. A handful managed to escape north across the Zambezi into Zambia to join the few that were already there. But for the majority, the gates of Sikwambela prison in Rhodesia slammed shut behind them. And that, for all intents and purposes, was that. And no sooner had it happened than the violence in the countryside was curtailed and peace returned to the land. Southern Rhodesian Prime Minister Ian Douglas-Smith, as he absorbed the congratulations of his electorate, would have had cause to reflect that these hardline measures had not only been successful but had generally been well received. And this gave him the courage to step forward and pick that fight with the British over this question of white minority rule. And as we've heard, what followed was a series of angry exchanges between London and Salisbury that lasted throughout 1965. And this shone a very thin ray of hope into the prisons of Rhodesia, where the black nationalists hoped against hope that some sort of negotiated settlement would occur that would bring an end to this crisis sooner rather than later. But in November 1965, with the declaration of UDI, these hopes were shattered, and it became clear to all of them that they would remain in prison for so long as White Rhodesia survived. And at that point, the omens for the survival of White Rhodesia were very good indeed. And this then began a period of months of deep and morbid reflection on the part of those now languishing in prison. And certain obvious conclusions were reached. Leadership committees in exile were formed in Lusaka, Zambia. War councils were established, and the business of building armies began.